Just about an hour ago, I got you fired.
What? What did you do that for?
I figured that being my wife would take up all of your time.
After the Second World War, society was forced to return to the traditionalist values that once defined someone's sex. This heavy push of post-war traditionalism was aided through the power of advertising and marketing. The first series of Mad Men explores the aftermath of this decade-wide push, or as Tim Malkin from Worcester State University once described it, a deep look through the cigarette haze and alcohol shows the period's strict gender roles and patriarchal norms and reflects the ever-present normative attitudes and behaviors of men that lead to sexual harassment and sexist stereotypes. Among other things, the show explores the jobs given to women by the post-war traditionalism push and how those who do not fit into the mold challenges this gender-divided system. The first season in particular is helpful in understanding this system and how to break it, with the introduction of the self-motivated character of Peggy Olson and her boss, Don Draper. Peggy is set up as the new secretary to Don Draper. Don is the show's protagonist, or really antagonist, as he is the embodiment of the successful, self-made man. As the human equivalent of the American dream, however, this leads the other men in the office to look up to him and think that in order to become successful, they must have dominant power over others. This normally leads to multiple accounts of sexual verbal harassment for the sake of a joke.
Wouldn't be a sin for us to see your legs. If you pull your waist in a little bit, you might look like a woman.
Now back to Peggy. In our first scene with her, we see the new girl become victim to one of these so-called jokes by the men that crowd around her in the elevator.
Not right away. Now, can you take the long way up? I am really enjoying the view here.
Unlike the other women at the office, Peggy is disgusted by these comments made by the men around her, not finding it flattering whatsoever. Later we come to observe that she is again different from the other girls in her office, as she values brains over beauty.
I'm very particular.
As opposed to the other girls?
I don't know. I don't think anyone wants to be one of 100 colors in a box.
I think that's enough complaining.
Other women in the office, like her boss Joan, find this unnerving, as this goes against the traditionalist values that the other ladies of the office keep close to heart.
How many trains did it take you?
Only one, but I got up very early.
In a couple of years, with the right moves, you'll be in the city with the rest of us. Of course, if you really make the right moves, you'll be out in the country and you won't be going to work at all.
If anything, this propels Peggy into becoming a woman of her own, not letting her gender come in the way of her career. Unlike the other women of the era, Joan, Betty, and Rachel, the office Aphrodite, the consumer of post-war traditionalist advertising, and the modern-day businesswoman. In Mad Men Unbuttoned, Natasha Vargas Cooper describes Joan as well-intentioned but sometimes clumsy. Joan believes that she can teach the girls in her life how to get the most from men. Both upholding and disproving sexist conventions of the time, we can see that Joan is fully aware of the objectification that she receives from the men in the office. But instead of swooning over the attention, she uses this attention to her advantage by asserting her dominance over the women of the office and even some of the men. This is highlighted powerfully in a season 1 scene where the viewer understands through a series of low camera angles that the men are in power, but are susceptible to a woman's curvaceous figure. We'll call this the lipstick scene. In the lipstick scene, for men, Joan rises to the occasion, showing off her femininity and figure, imposes smiles and comments targeted towards the other women in the room. For Joan, however, this is her gaining power. Showing her backside and blowing smoke into the other women's faces convey that she has not only got the men's attention, who are looking through a one-sided mirror, but bring awareness to the control that she can achieve on the, as the men call them, chickens. Almost becoming a double agent for both genders. Experiencing this as a viewer, we can deduct that Joan is using all her assets to get ahead of the game, something that many women had to do in the 1960s and even some today. Now on to our consumer, Betty Draper. From the first time we see her, we know that she has the idealized life all the women in the office are so desperately climbing towards. This ideal life includes a 2-story house with a white picket fence accompanied by 2 small children. Betty is trapped, however, in the false promise of marriage that society expects to bring her happiness. She becomes bored and feels like her life is unfulfilled, something other women in the program come to learn the hard way. Last but not least, we have Rachel Menken. Rachel is introduced as an unsuspecting martyr of female empowerment in the show. She is constantly being compared to the men in her life.
Miss Menken, coupons work. I think your father would agree with the strategy.
He might. But he's not here because we just had our lowest sales year, ever. So I suppose what I think matters most right now.
She demonstrates in the context of the show that a woman doesn't need a man to be successful in life. Rachel inherited the role of CEO of the Menken's department stores, and although has all that she could desire, Rachel still feels pressure to settle down and marry. But when she consults with her sister about this, the viewer and Rachel alike are fed the opposite of Joan's advice.
You're a modern woman, Mitch. Forget the wedding. I'd do anything for some romance right now.
The baby crying when Rachel's sister says forget the wedding is for the viewer to be reminded how mundane and simple the suburban life is, and for Rachel to be reminded of the path in life she has chosen. Rachel later pointed out to the show's protagonist, Dawn, how cruel it is for her to have to choose.
If I weren't a woman, I would be allowed to ask you the same question. And if I weren't a woman, I wouldn't have to choose between putting on an apron and the thrill of making my father's store what I always thought it should be.
In conclusion, what Mad Men shows is the overt control by old white men of the social world order, which ensures their dominant role in society, as seen at the end of episode 6 of season 1, where, with a long shot, the men had the figurative and literal higher ground. But why make this program in 2015? For this, let's return to the quote at the beginning of the video. A deep look through the cigarette haze and alcohol shows the period's strict gender roles and patriarchal norms and reflects the ever-present normative attitudes and behaviors of men that lead to sexual harassment and sexist stereotypes. It also allows us to see the double standards and the locker room mentalities that are now being challenged by the Me Too movement and continue to shape our world today. Through a range of female characters in Mad Men, we see those who haven't been fed post-war traditionalism propaganda rely on any strategy to beat the men at their own game and be taken seriously, while those who are bought into the false promise of a suburban life consider themselves only temporarily working in business until they can marry and retreat to a home with children. However, while they consider themselves as yet unworthy of the prize due to them being in the workplace, this show displays through Betty Draper and Rachel's sister that the prize of a suburban life is not worth winning, and that women like Peggy and Joan are better off making their own way in life.